I'm Jean Beeman. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at Purdue University in Indiana, and it's my fifth year on faculty here. And I'm also affiliated with the Global Studies program and the African and African American Studies program. I do research on race and racism and immigration in both the United States and France. My book, Citizen Outsider: Children of North African Immigrants in France, is about the second generation North African immigrant population in France. So people who were born in France to parents who immigrated to France from former French colonies in the Maghreb, which is either Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. So the goal of the book the goal of the study is to understand how minority groups, how this particular ethnic minority groups understand what it means to be a minority in a context in which you can't talk about race and ethnicity as easily as you can in other plural societies such as the United States. I focus on the middle class segment of the second generation population. So these are individuals who, as I said earlier, were born in France and have lived their whole lives in France and were educated in French schools. And many of them have graduate degrees and have sort of more professional kinds of jobs, whether it's being a banker or a journalist or a lawyer or those sorts of things. But what I found in my book is that they even despite their sort of middle class status, they still feel that they're marginalized because they're seen as non-white or because they're ethnic minorities. So their sense of belonging to France is very complicated because oftentimes they see themselves as French because that's the only society they've ever lived in, for example. But they recognize that other French people don't see them, other French people who are white, for example, don't see them as French. So that sort of sense of belonging or that sense of sort of connection to France is continually challenged by other people. So I think they respond to it in a multitude of ways. I mean, one I think is that they sort of hunker down and insist upon their Frenchness, or more explicitly insist that they're just as French as other French populations, partly due to the colonial relationship between France and the Maghreb, and then also due to the fact that they've only lived in France. But another response is sort of resisting, French society entirely, which is then how some of my respondents talk about wanting to move to other countries or other societies because they feel like, despite the fact that they've done everything right, they're still not accepted as French by others. There's not anything else that they can do to sort of change that. I did my research in the Paris metropolitan area, and so I was doing interviews with people who lived in the Paris proper within the city limits, and then also people who lived in the outskirts, what we refer to as the Banlieues or suburban communities just outside of Paris. And those are the communities that historically have more immigrant origin individuals or immigrants and their descendants, partly due to sort of the history of migration patterns over many years. So anyway, for many of my respondents, they often feel more comfortable in their skin, if you will, in some of these sort of, predominantly immigrant origin communities. And again, this is regardless of their actual socioeconomic status, because these communities tend to be more impoverished than some of the neighborhoods in the center of Paris, for example. But they're also much more ethnically diverse than some of the neighborhoods in the center of Paris. And so I think the sort of idea, especially for my respondents who are middle class, that they have to sort of work in, predominantly white spaces or go to school in predominantly white universities, living in an environment that has more ethnic diversity is really meaningful for them for feeling more connected to where they live. So in terms of the actual sort of markers of knowing places where some of my respondents feel like they can belong, it could be things like, the number of, mosques in a particular community, or it could be something like the number of like halal supermarkets or restaurants to community, right? So just kind of indicating that this is not just supposed to be, this particular neighborhood or community is not just supposed to be a sort of white space. I think you could even think about it in contrast with like, the Champs-Élysées or a popular street like in, Paris proper. So, a lot of these streets in the banlieues, they'll be more dilapidated buildings. There'll be more sort of vacancies. And the restaurants will be more casual, I guess, for lack of a better word, more kind of street markets that you'd find within the city proper, or within in the sort of like, Grand Boulevard of Paris. You can still find some of that in Paris itself. So it's actually not that, the first time I went, I felt like it wasn't that different from what I had experienced in some communities in Baltimore, which is kind of near where I grew up. If that helps. Sonically, I would say you probably hear more, you definitely hear I mean, you hear French spoken, but you also hear Arabic spoken, and so that's also reflected both in the sort of like the the language you can hear, and also just like the music that's playing outside too. So I think that's a big marker between some of these communities and some of the kind of more expensive neighborhoods within Paris itself. I think it's important to note that a lot of these communities are more, ethnically diverse than similar communities in the United States. Even though there is a concentration of people who are North African origin and sub-Saharan African origin in these spaces as well. So I think that's the first thing I would say. So it wouldn't be uncommon to see white people in these spaces, but you would see fewer of them than you would in other parts of the Paris metropolitan region. Another thing that is happening, to answer your question, is sort of rapid gentrification. So, for example, I've been doing research in Paris for over a decade now, and some of these older immigrant neighborhoods on the outskirts of Paris, but still within Paris, have been like gentrified or now are like super, hipster or hip or what have you. And so a lot of the original residents of those communities are being pushed further out to outside of the city limits itself. So that's something that's currently happening right now in terms of sort of changing the demographic reality of some of these spaces. I think you're seeing kind of what I was saying before. You're seeing in these sort of hipster, these neighborhoods that have become more hipster, there's more and more sort of like trendy ethnic food restaurants. So it's like not just a sort of Singaporean restaurant, it'll be sort of like a hipster take on that, if that makes any sense. And then also more and more like kind of wine bars, like those kinds of things, or like tapas kind of places, places that are sort of geared to a particular age demographic as well.